Hi, welcome to Key Questions with Key Staffers. My name is Jim Atterholt. I'm the Vice Mayor for the town of Fort Myers Beach. This is a show where we find subject matter experts, particularly as it relates to post-Ian cleanup and recovery efforts. And we really take a deep dive into the tough issues of the day. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Let the people know the facts and the country will be saved." And this is our small attempt to do that. We will certainly be posting this on all the town's social media platforms. But our friends at Beach Talk Radio have been kind enough to play this before their regular scheduled programming on Friday and Saturday. And we hope our friends at the Observer and the News Press and the local TV stations will link to this, particularly when they're working on a story that's germane to our subject matter. And also, as importantly, we're hoping that the folks, you folks that were listening, could also share this on your Facebook page, particularly if it's a subject matter that you think would be helpful to your friends and neighbors. I think the subject matter today will be of interest to everyone because it impacts everyone here on the island. We have a special guest today. His name is Chauncy Goss, and Chauncy is the board chairman for the South Florida Water Management District. Is there an acronym for that?
There isn't. The one to the north of us is a SWIFMUD, which is ironically the Southwest Florida Water Management District, which we are not in. We are in the South Florida Water Management District. Sometimes it's called SOFMUD, but most people just call it the district.
Now, this is going to sound really dry initially, but I'm telling you what, the organization that Chauncy leads is really responsible for, and I don't think I'm overestimating, the revolutionary efforts that are occurring in Southern Florida to clean our water and to transform how the Everglades functions, how Lake Okeechobee functions, the Caloosahatchee. It is going to be, we're talking billions of dollars that are being sent to this important task, and particularly given the challenges that we faced most recently with Hurricane Ian and now with the most recent red tide dynamic, it's really critical to talk about this and to encourage people to get in touch with their members of Congress, their state legislature, support the governor, the president, just to support these efforts, which are really ongoing and substantive. And I want to help tell that story this morning to give people not only to find out where we are today, but also give them a message of hope that the future is very, very bright down here from a quality, clean water standpoint. So, Chauncy, as we see the impact of Hurricane Ian and talk a little bit about how Ian, we'll get into the red tide here in just a second, but how Ian itself affected water quality. Chauncey's from Sanibel, lives in Sanibel, has a home in Sanibel. We'll talk a little bit about how he was impacted by the storm. But before we get to that, talk a little bit about how Hurricane Ian itself and the debris remnants impacted water quality in our area.
Well, hurricanes are natural disasters, as you know, and so when we have natural disasters, we have things that our systems are basically designed to deal with averages, and we can do very well with the averages. When we get into those natural disasters, we get away from the averages, and that's when our systems become overwhelmed. So that's what we generally see happen as a district, and that's what we try and work around. So before a hurricane, what we'll do is we've got 2,000 miles of canals. We'll start, when we know, when our meteorologists are very good and they work closely with the National Hurricane Center, when we know where those hurricanes, where we think the rain's going to come, we start moving water out of those canals. We prepare the system, as it were. Lake Okeechobee is a little bit hard to prepare because it's so big and it takes so long to move water in and out of it. So what we try and do during the wet season is to keep the lake low enough so that we don't have to pump water out, so we don't have the awful discharges that we had in 2016 and 2018. And we were able to do that this time. So we're pretty happy about that. But having said that, we got a ton of rain. So that rain didn't just come on Lake Okeechobee, it came all throughout our watershed. And when it does, it overwhelms the systems and all the systems. When you have an island here covered by 6-7 feet of water, there's no water management system that's functioning then. Everything's underwater. So from a water quality standpoint, it's awful. If you think about just in your house, what do you have in your garage? And all of a sudden it's all underwater. Your car is underwater. All the fertilizer you have in your garage is underwater. The sewer system's underwater. All of that stuff gets mixed in. So from a water quality standpoint, not real good. You also have a ton of debris from vegetation. So that adds a lot of nutrients into the water. So you just take that big toxic soup and put it together. And that's what we end up with after the hurricanes, where you have either Irma or more recently Ian. And it causes really havoc to the natural system. So when you have a red tide out there, which is naturally occurring and is sort of always like lurking out in the Gulf, which it is, then you feed it all of this stuff. And that's sort of what we're looking at now. And again, I'm not a scientist, so this is a sort of a lay perspective, but I think I'm trying to make it easy enough so that I can understand it and everyone else can understand it. And so when you take a red tide that's already there anyway, and then you add all these nutrients to it, you just exacerbate the system.
And Chauncey, is you, and I know I'm not looking for percentages, but just ballpark, as we look at the most recent red tide, and we've, like last, I think it was a week ago, we picked up 13 tons of dead fish on the beach. Yeah. Not to the scale of 2018, but certainly very troubling, particularly as we're all trying to recover from this hurricane. It's been rough. And so I guess my question is you look at Hurricane Ian and you look at the red tide that we've recently experienced, although it seems to be getting better, at least today. I'll ask you about that too in terms of your sense and what you're hearing. But is the red tide and the fish kill, what percentage of it is it of Hurricane Ian? What percentage is it the watershed? What percentage is it Lake Okeechobee? And what percentage is natural occurring? In other words, obviously Ian overwhelmed the whole watershed, and like you said, put all kinds of bad things into the water in terms of debris, various types of debris. But did the hurricane itself impact red tide? In other words, did it churn it up? Did it push it towards us? How does it all come together in the big picture?
You probably have to talk to the oceanographer more than me on that. But generally, it will. Yes, it mixes up the lake. So the lake absolutely has a lot of nutrients in it, Lake Okeechobee, and that gets mixed up quite a bit in the hurricanes. We saw that in Irma, and we're going to see it again in Ian. We're worried about that right now with some of the blue-green algae, because all those nutrients do get mixed up. And so after the hurricanes, we tend to see bigger blue-green algae outbreaks. You're talking about red tide specifically. I don't know from the Gulf how much stirring up matters on red tide. And you asked about percentages. Yeah, how much of it's out there anyway, how much of it's from our watershed, and how much of it's coming from the lake. We know how much is coming from the lake because we know how much we're releasing. And right now we've been releasing, I think it's 2,000 CFS, cubic feet per second, which is, it's basically in the beneficial zone. During this time of year, we like to have fresh water coming out of the lake because we'd like to have fresh water in the upper estuary because it helps some of the grasses up there. And by helping those grasses, we help the ecosystem up there work a little bit better. So I don't think any of the discharges we're having right now, I can't say they're not impacting water quality at all, but I'd like to think they're not impacting it very much. And we're certainly, the discharges we're doing right now are meant to be beneficial more than anything else. Yeah, they're meant to get a little bit of water off the lake, but we're not pulling tons of water off the lake. Tons is the wrong term, but we're not pulling as much water off the lake as we would be if we were in a panic situation. We're trying to get the lake to the point where come June 1st, come hurricane season again, we're not in a bad situation where the lake is really high.
So it's likely that a lot of the exacerbation of the existing red tide right now occurred as a result of the debris that just was washed into the bay and the ocean. And like you said, all the vehicles, the motor oil, gasoline.
Well, I think the nutrients is probably more. So you've got a lot of agriculture that takes place in this watershed. That if you sort of look between here and the lake, there's plenty that happens that's not part, coming out of the lake, coming straight down the Caloosahatchee. There's agriculture there. And then there's everything else that's happening.
So it's that runoff.
It's just urban runoff.
Yeah.
There's agricultural runoff, there's urban runoff, and that just all gets mixed in because normally you have stormwater systems that take that stuff and they put it in holding ponds or whatever, and that just all gets overwhelmed.
Yeah. Do you have you? I know you're surrounded by a lot of experts in your organization. Have you heard about where we are in red tide? Is it forecast to get better, same, or I know it's difficult to predict, but
it's really hard to predict. FWC actually handles red tide for the state, and actually I'll be meeting with them tomorrow. And they put out really good charts that show where it is. They take samples and they show you on those charts what the samples are showing where it's popping up. Right now, this one's from Tampa all the way down to the Keys. That's a huge area.
This
And
red tide,
this-
they call it a bloom, or what are they?
Yeah, yeah, it's a bloom,
Uh-huh.
and it's someplace. One thing I found, I grew up on Sanibel. We moved here in 1970, so I was 4 years old, and I've spent my whole life on Sanibel for the most part. And one thing I noticed about red tide is you can have it, on one end of the island and not the other end of the island. You can have it on one side of the island and not the other side of the island. It's really patchy, and you'll see the same things here, I'm sure, on the beach, where it's someone can be screaming about red tide and say it's really bad, and a mile away it's not. So that's the same thing. You take that all the way from Tampa down to the Keys, and some places are really bad and some places aren't. My brother lives up in St. Pete, Clearwater area. He said he can't go outside. He said it's just really tough right now. So it depends.
There's been a lot of the last couple of years. There's been a lot of dollars appropriated for research for the impact of red tide on human health. Have we learned anything new over the last few years?
Gosh, I hope so. It's not just human health. It's not just research over the last couple of years. I was thinking back when I was driving over here. I remember talking. My dad was a member of Congress. He was elected in 1988, and I remember one of the first things talking to him about. He was on the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee back then when they had a Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee. It's long since disbanded, and I remember talking to him about red tide, and he was talking about the money that Congress was spending. This was back in the mid 80s. So 40 years ago, I'm thinking we've been studying this thing a long time. We spent a lot of money. I hope we're learning something. I don't know. I haven't seen the fruits of our labor there, but I'm hoping it's there, and I'm hoping it's close. I know that the University of Florida did a pretty neat study in the last couple of years, and they're spending some money on it now, where they're starting to use supercomputers. They're starting to use probably even artificial intelligence to try and help them with their modeling to figure out if they can sort of figure out what's feeding the red tide and then track it back to where it actually came from. So you can then go in when you know that, then you sort of have a rifle shot approach to being able to fix the problem rather than a shotgun approach. So you can say, okay, the problem is coming from here, and if you can get really good, you can say it's coming from that community and it's that field, or just absolutely narrow it down.
But in terms of human health, should people just trust their senses? In other words, if you're out there and you're coughing, and or should they avoid it, or how should people worry about it?
Yeah, I'd leave that to you and your doctor. But I think if you've got respiratory issues, you need to be aware of it. And I've known people over the years. We used to live in Boca Grande, and Boca Grande gets really bad red tides. I remember in the 90s, I knew people there who would just leave, for a month, because it would settle in, and it was really, if you had asthma, it was very difficult to breathe, and you probably shouldn't be around it. We're doing a lot more research now, and I know Lee Health had been doing some research, I think also with Martin Health. Martin Health was looking probably more at the blue-green algae back in 16, 17 after those outbreaks. But Lee Health was also looking at it, and I think they started to code in the ERs respiratory issues, whether you've been exposed to red tide or blue-green algae or water, so that they can start to maybe track back, and which is really helpful from the emergency room standpoint and the epidemiological standpoint.
This may be a dumb question, but how does red tide kill the fish, and how does it?
I think it just starves them of oxygen.
Starves them. So
I think, and again, I'm not a marine biologist. I'm guessing on that one, but I think so.
So, as I follow this issue, and I've been in public service for 35 years, and in politics to some extent, and I was here in 18, and it was really apocalyptic, quite honestly, in terms of a red tide and fish killing.
Okay.
There were mountains of fish, and
I'd never seen anything like it.
Bulldozers literally we were living on the beach, and it was again apocalyptic. I've never seen anything like it, and it was great to see. We had a new governor come in, new legislature, and they took a whole fresh approach. And normally, again, being somewhat cynical in politics at my age, you generally hear this rhetorical flourish, and then all of a sudden nothing happens. But something did happen. Significant dollars were appropriated to take some massive steps to try to get to the core challenges of red tide. And I was so encouraged by that because one of the things that Fort Myers Beach is working on, we're working on a $32 million beach renourishment plan. We're going to have an emergency dune, a berm that'll be put in initially, then a renourishment, and the beaches are going to be spectacular in a year from now, maybe even a little over a year. And then you couple that with some of the wonderful things that are happening that you're doing. And I don't think people realize the hope that's coming. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that. Let's, before we get into the details of the money, let's, and I know we've got some viewers who are extremely sophisticated on this, but others who are sort of wondering what we're talking about. And I wish I had a picture of the map, a map of Florida on the back here, but you've got this giant lake, Lake Okeechobee, in the sort of the center of the state, and it's when it reaches capacity, it's sending water to the Caloosahatchee, which feeds into Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach there in the bay. And one of the things you guys are talking about, and I want you to get into the more granular talks, but you're thinking about using some massive reservoirs to catch that water so you can control the flow better, but you're also going to potentially clean that water as well before it comes down the river. Is that an oversimplification?
Sure, but it's accurate.
Okay.
So it's okay.
But again, the other concept is, years before we had all this development here in Florida, the water would flow south. And we've done a bunch of stuff over the years to the Everglades, all these roads that go across east to west that have blocked that water from flowing south. And as the water flows north to south, going through the Everglades and all these marshes, it gets naturally filtered and cleaned. And we've eliminated through our intrusion a lot of that cleaning process that occurs. And so explain a little bit about, we've got we've got a river that goes east, we've got a river that goes west, which is the Caloosahatchee. And it seems like we have a reservoir for each of those that's under construction, one of which I think is almost done, if not done. And then ours is the C43 reservoir. Talk a little bit about what that is. I don't think people have any idea how huge these things are.
Yeah, they are huge. Let me start by trying to put everything in context, and that might help, especially for those of you who are familiar with this. Bear with me. For those of you who aren't, I think it'll be helpful to try and understand how we got where we are. And it goes back to the hurricanes that we had sort of in the 20s, 30s, and 40s that really devastated the lake communities and flooded eastern Florida, southeastern Florida, to a point where the federal government became involved and came up with something called the Central and Southern Florida System, the CNSF. And that's where the South Florida Water Management District came in. And our job with the Corps of Engineers was to drain the Everglades. And the Corps of Engineers is really good at doing their job. So they drained the Everglades. The problem with doing that is the Everglades, it's really not good for the Everglades to drain the Everglades, because the Everglades is an incredible ecosystem. It's the only one like it in the world, and you don't want to drain it the way we did, which is, as you said, pumping water straight east and west. You want that water to sheet flow south. So that's what we're doing now, is we're replumbing the Everglades and redoing some of the things that we did. And we're doing it in a way that we can still have Miami, that we can still have Fort Lauderdale, we can still have Palm Beach, and they can still, flood control is still our number one mission as the Water Management District. Water supply is also part of our mission, and Everglades restoration is part of our mission. So we have to take all those things, and they conflict at times, and try and put them together to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Going back to 2018, the devastating red tide we saw here, we had then candidate DeSantis come down, and he was very inquisitive and wanted to know what was going on down here. He wanted to know what was going on with blue-green algae. He wanted to know what was going on with red tide. And he took him out in a boat, and he saw this, and he said, "Oh my God." And I think his wife was with him, and he said, "This is just awful. This can't happen. Why is it happening? What can we do to stop it?" And he really became involved in it. And he has been just an incredible advocate for it. And when he had his first budget, I think it was the second or third day in office, it was his first executive order. He said, "We're going to spend $2.5 billion as a state to try and address these issues
over the next 4 years."
Over the next 4 years. And that was his first term. And he actually exceeded that with the legislature. So we say thank you to the legislature, thank you to the governor. And we, the Water Management District, are part of the executing agency for that. So then he was reelected, and he's just come out with a new executive order. He wants to spend $3.5 billion over the next 4 years. So we have an incredible amount of resource to be able to do what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is something called the Central Everglades Restoration Plan, or SERP.
Before you start on that, because we're talking about the funding has been amazing. The last year of the previous administration, I think there was $250 million that was appropriated. I've heard big numbers potentially from this administration. Have we seen a number yet from the feds yet? And has any money arrived yet, or where are we on that, on the federal side?
President Biden released his budget on Thursday. It was what they call a skinny budget, and it didn't have details, and the details should come out today. I don't know what's in it for.
What about the first 2 years?
The first 2 years, last year we saw some money for that, for the southern reservoir, which we need. And there was also some money in the infrastructure bill, I believe.
Okay.
So we are getting some money from the federal government. And as part of SERP, we're in a 50-50 cost share between the state and the federal government. And what that's for is, I think there were 68 or 69 projects identified in SERP that are supposed to be built. This was 23 years ago. It was in 2000 that SERP was authorized. And Dad was actually a member of Congress back then, and he actually voted for this bill. So it's 23 years later. We have not finished many of those projects.
Yeah.
And going back to what you were talking about, probably the best ways to deal with the water that we have in South Florida, we get 52, 53 inches of water a year, but we don't get, an inch of water a week. We get, over the last 3 months, I don't think we've had any rain, and then we'll get it all in the summer. So we don't have a very good way to store water. And that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to figure out how to store water. We can't go down because we're Florida. So what we're doing is we're going up and we're creating these reservoirs. So we've got 3 reservoirs planned right now. One was just completed. That was over on the east coast of the C-44 in the St. Lucie. It's in Indiantown, Florida. And C-44 is basically the St. Lucie River.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one on the Caloosahatchee River, which is also called the C-43. And that is in Hendry County, right after you go over the line, right before you come into LaBelle. It's on your right as you're driving into LaBelle. And you were talking about the size of these things. That is our middle-sized reservoir, and it's 6 miles by 3 miles, which, you could just take in your head and go, okay, it's 6 by 3. That's big. But then you think of, okay, on Fort Myers Beach, what is 6 by 3? I don't think you're 3 miles wide anywhere on this beach, is my guess. So and then take 6 miles, and I don't know how far 6 miles. I don't know if that's beyond Publix. I don't know.
Yeah.
From where we're sitting now, it's a big area. And that's
It's like 10,500 acres.
Yeah, then when you start going into acres and acre feet, you absolutely lose me. But
it's monstrous.
It's huge. Yeah. It's huge. So that has been under construction for about it's been more than 4 years, but primary construction 4 years now. It's a little behind. We're working on that. The contractor's fallen behind, but we're trying to rectify that now, and then that should be done in the next couple of years. And then that's going to be great, because that allows us to store water during the dry season, so that we can put it back, or during the wet season, so we can put it back into the system when we need it.
So C-43 for the Caloosahatchee, because it originally was predicted to be done 2023, right?
It was.
And so what's the hope then on that at this point?
We're probably about a year behind.
A year behind. So 2024 is the goal?
I think so.
Okay. And so the C-44, which is the St. Lucie, which goes into the Atlantic, that's done, correct?
That is done. And
tell me this, from a lay perspective, how does it work?
So they'll work a little bit differently. And since the C-44 is not in my backyard, I don't know it as well. But generally, the theory is you take water off of the river and pull it into these reservoirs. And what that one can do is, there's a big stormwater treatment area, which is basically a huge marsh that cleans the water. So we have the land over there, and we are cleaning the water in the St. Lucie, and it's working really well. The stormwater treatment area there is beautiful. It's just a huge marsh. So if you want to go birding, it's a great place to go birding. On this side, we did not have the land for a big stormwater treatment area. So we're going to be treating the water a little differently. We're going to be treating it chemically, I think, with alum, to try and knock some of the nutrients out of it. So when the water comes back into the system, it will be treated, but it won't be treated naturally as it was in the marsh on the East Coast. And then the sort of the crown jewel of all of our water storage right now will be south, and that's the EAA, or Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. And that thing is enormous. And I don't know how many miles it is. I should, but it's bigger than the C-43 reservoir. We broke ground. The Corps of Engineers is building that, and broke ground on it last month.
Is the one you just referred to in the C-44 that is done and open, is that providing any help to Sanibel and Fort Myers Beach?
Probably not. It probably is if it's providing help to anybody, it would probably be Fort Pierce and in that area, and over on the St. Lucie side.
Because they can only take so much, right?
Yeah.
C-44, and it can only go so much through the St. Lucia, right?
Right.
Okay. And then so when C-43 is done, the water that would come down through the Caloosahatchee to Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel, that'll be deposited in this basin, or what?
Not all of it, but what we can do is pull some of it off.
Uh-huh.
So you can pull off however many hundreds of thousands of acre feet, and I forgot.
It's monstrous, yeah.
You can pull off a lot. It's again 6 miles by 3 miles. It's a lot of water, and you can treat it, which we do, and then you can put it back into the system when you want it. So and that's the key, is making sure you can put the water back in, because again, we get enough rain from the sky. We just don't get the rain when we want it. This helps us. It's quality, quantity, timing, and distribution are sort of the 4 things we look at as a water management district. This helps us with that, because it lets us manipulate the
And Chauncey,
distribution of it.
when that's all up and running and functioning fully, that means less nutrients will be going down the Caloosahatchee and feeding red tide, or exacerbating red tide, exacerbating blue-green algae. But will it have any other impact? In other words, let's say red tide's not flourishing at that time. Will it actually make our water cleaner?
Well,
Will we see it?
I don't know if you'll see it, but it'll help. It'll help with the discharges a little bit, which is something we really want to have happen, obviously. And when we have the EAA reservoir finished, that's going to help with the discharge. I mean, all these things work together. So if you look at any individual component, they do something, but when they are all working together, the sum of their parts is much better.
Mhm.
And that's why we're trying to get all of the SERP projects done, so that we have that. And we're not there yet. Within the next decade, we will, but we're not. So every single one of these that comes online gives us that incremental benefit. But we're in, it's hard for me to attribute how much any single one of them is going to do. I'm sure someone can, but we've got really smart modelers who can.
But I think I read somewhere where C43 will literally cut the amount of nutrients going towards our area by half, roughly. Right? Is that fair?
Maybe coming from the lake.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
But coming from the lake, maybe it will, and I don't know. I should probably know that number, but I don't. It won't do anything for our watershed, and there's a lot of water coming from our watershed. Those are separate issues that we can work on as a state, and we are working on as a state. But it'll certainly help discharges coming out of the lake. So that you've got 2 issues with discharges coming out of the lake. One is the quantity of it, and it's going to help with the quantity, so we can hopefully get rid of those really heavy discharges. And we can get some discharges when we want them during the dry season, and then also help a little bit with the quality.
And again, I'm no marine biologist either, but as that water comes down the Caloosahatchee, that's obviously fresh water. When it runs into Sanibel, Fort Myers Beach, it hits the salt water. But it's important to have that Caloosahatchee flow at a certain level to keep the fresh water where it needs to be. Like you said, the grasses will flourish. So in other words, if the C43 comes, it not only cleans it, but also helps regulate the flow. That could create a healthier environment as well for our area, correct?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And as water managers, we're very cognizant of, we have salinity gradients that we look at up and down the Caloosahatchee, and we're always when we're looking at our releases, we're trying to make sure those gradients stay where they're supposed to, so that they're most healthy for. I think we use oysters as one of our sentinel species, so we can sort of tell, okay, if the oysters are doing well, that's good for some of the other species, and grasses for the other one.
And that would mean the fish would flourish.
Exactly.
Right? Better fishing, better everything.
Where that fresh and salt water come together, it makes the estuary, and that is really the nursery for all the fisheries.
Excellent. So your agency, the South Florida Water Management District, how does it jurisdictionally interact with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection? And you always hear about the Army Corps of Engineers, who regulates the flow from Lake Okeechobee. Those are some pretty big organizations you're working with. From a jurisdictions and a cooperation standpoint, how does it all work just from a lay perspective? Because I know it's incredibly complicated.
It is complicated, and it's a very collaborative effort. We work really closely with the Corps of Engineers. The Corps is part of the Army and is federal. So it's the way it does things is a little differently than the way the state does, and a little differently than the way that the district would do things, because we're a district, so we can be a little more autonomous, and we can be a little bit more free flowing if we have to be. We've got 1,400 employees, where the Corps, I don't know how big the Corps is, but it's got a lot more than that. And then the state DEP we work very closely with as well, and we work the DEP helps us coordinate with the way that the governor wants to go for his policies, and we work really closely with Secretary Hamilton from DEP, and that's a good working relationship. Our executive director, Drew Bartlett, used to work in DEP. He worked at EPA before that. He's got just a phenomenal career of working in water, so he knows everybody and knows everyone's as you said, everyone's got their sort of their lane. So it's understanding everyone's lane and making sure that we're all working together to make sure that the public gets what they should be getting.
And I was surprised here. This is where we're walking in. You're a volunteer.
I am a volunteer.
And your board is all volunteer.
We are.
And you basically set policy for your executive director and
Yep.
your team to implement. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so as you're working with these entities, the billions of dollars that are being appropriated, hopefully more will be coming. Those are probably split up within your various agencies depending on what the task is. Is that right?
Yeah, we do a lot of the execution. What'll happen is the legislature will pass a bill, and then generally that money will go to the Department of Environmental Protection, and then the Department of Environmental Protection will give us that money to actually implement whatever that is or to execute on the money. And from the federal standpoint, the Corps gets that money, and then they will, if it's part of this 50-50 cost share, if it's something we're doing, they will then reimburse us for it.
And the Everglades, is this part of the Everglades restoration piece, the reservoirs, or is that a separate piece?
The Everglades restoration, the reservoirs are absolutely part of that.
So when we talk about Everglades restoration, and again, I know enough to be dangerous, but one of the things that fascinates me is we try to get the water to be able to flow all the way naturally south, so it can be cleaned naturally. These roads, we're literally going back and elevating roads that at one point were blocking the flow of the water. Is that a big part of a part of the Everglades restoration project?
Yeah, it has been. So when we talk about the estuaries, we talk a lot about the Caloosahatchee estuary. We talk a lot about the St. Lucie estuary. The other estuary is Florida Bay. And making sure that we can move water south. And that's the whole point of this, is that we're trying not to move water east and west. We're trying to move it south again so that it gets down to Florida Bay. And the only way you can do that is to raise US 41, which is what we have done our Tamiami Trail. So that has been raised. A couple of miles have been raised. A couple more miles will be raised. And that's allowed us to put water down south of 41 into Everglades National Park. It then is able to flow from the park down into Florida Bay, which helps their estuary because they've had a tough time when they're starved from water. They get hypersalinity down there. They have and their grasses all die off, and it gets really ugly.
I've read, obviously, this has a huge impact on our environment, which is the big positive. But I've also read that there's a 4-to-1 return on investment for each dollar that's spent in this restoration project for the economy of Florida. Explain how that works.
Yeah, I don't know what the multiplier is, and it's always interesting to me to talk to the economists about how they come up with these multipliers. But
because you are an economist by training, aren't you?
No, not quite.
A finance person,
close,
right? Yeah,
public policy, but close enough. I've hung out with enough economists to know they have two hands. But I think that the multiplier effect is really important. And when you look at water quality, I think you have to sort of look at why you're in Florida, why all of us are in Florida. You came here for the quality of life, is my guess. You could be anywhere in the world, and you're here, and you're probably here because you like it here, and you're probably here because you like the quality of life, and that quality of life then ties to water quality. So you look at our tourism industry, and you look at, okay, what's the trickle down on that? What's the trickle down? Or inversely, what happens if the tourists don't come? So if you look at 2018, where you've got a tourist sitting in London going, gee, I want to go to Disney World, but then they're looking at pictures of dead fish on the beach in Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel going, oh, maybe I don't want to go to Disney World because that's in Florida. They have no clue that Disney World's nowhere near the beach. They're just saying Florida has got disgusting, dead fish on the beach. So there's a huge impact there where water quality, matters. So if we have a good quality of water, we have a good quality of environment, people want to come here. It brings the tourists, which as a homeowner here matters a lot to me because it means I don't have to pay tax. We don't have tax in Florida. The reason we don't have tax is because we have tourists. And that people don't always understand that. But exactly. If you get rid of the tourists, you're probably going to have tax here. So we want to keep people coming, and we don't want them here, all the time, and but you want them here enough that they keep our economy going. It's just a huge engine. Then you look at sort of the trickle down on that. You look at the marine industry, whether it's boat building, you look at the fishing industry, you look at the guides, you look at the people who make tackle, look at the people who sell tackle, you look at the people who sell bait, who sell gas. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And that's what you have to pay attention to. So when you understand, when someone says, oh, well, this isn't really a big deal, you have to, well, actually it is, because it's impacting all of these people. And then you look at what we're doing with the hurricane. Now you look at the the real estate industry, you look at the restaurant industry, the hospitality industry, all of those things were impacted in 2018. And that was all stuff that, maybe could have been avoided if we had managed our systems a little better. And that's what we're trying to do now, is manage the systems better to have as little impact as possible on that economy and those sub-economies.
And that's really encouraging, Chauncey. I remember back in 2018, I was just thinking about running for town council. And one of the things I was thinking about is how could we garner support for this effort, restoration project for the Everglades and these reservoirs. And I was thinking, we have all these snowbirds coming down, and how could we get them engaged in this fight? Because when they go home, they could write their congressman, their House member, or their senator in Indiana. So we started this little project. We called it the Snowbird Advocacy Army, and the town, in cooperation with the town, we did a mail piece to all of our folks, encouraging people who are visiting as snowbirds, when they get back to Indiana, write your congressman, write your senator, and encourage them to support Everglades restoration, because you can't just have the Florida delegation is fighting in competition for a limited number of resources, as you know. And so you've got to help broaden that base of support. We did ads in all the newspapers, and we encouraged people that were down here visiting to write their congressman and then their senator. And we encouraged all the Floridians who were here to write their state legislator, encourage the governor. And there was already great momentum post 18 for this. But I think, I guess I lead into that by saying, today, what can folks do to help? I mean, obviously they continue to write and communicate with their elected officials, but are there other things that people can do to be supportive?
Well, what you just pointed out was incredibly encouraging, and people did write their legislators, and it was helpful. And you see that because when someone says Everglades now, people know what they're talking about. As you know, there's a tremendous competition for money and for dollars in Washington, D.C. There is in Tallahassee too. Mm-hmm. But what I found encouraging, particularly since 2016, 2017, and in 18 was awful. Our state legislators, when they start talking, particularly the ones from this area, water quality is probably the first or second thing they'll talk about. And that's really encouraging. And that means that our constituency here has it's bubbled up. Our businesses here, same thing. They've done a really good job. Our chambers of commerce have done a really nice job. So it's not just the constituents; it's also the businesses where our elected officials have heard from them, so they understand the importance of water quality to our economy and to the local businesses here. So I think that just keeping that message alive, particularly after the hurricane, particularly for the beach and Sanibel, it's we're in rebuilding mode. The last thing you need is a red tide in the middle of it. And it's another gut punch. So we're, obviously the red tide, we can't control it, but we're trying to make sure we don't do anything to make it worse.
And one of the cool things, our council's nonpartisan. Is yours nonpartisan as well in Sanibel?
Yes.
So one of the cool things about this issue, this quality water, the Everglades restoration, it really has become nonpartisan. I don't know anybody who's against it. And so the question is, like you say, mobilizing that support in a way that we can continue those funds, and we can also build that national base of support from people who love to visit Florida, encouraging them to be in touch with their member of Congress, their U.S. senator, 2 U.S. senators. So that's the piece of the puzzle that's been so interesting about this discussion. You've got groups like Captains for Clean Water. There's never a partisan piece of this puzzle. It's all about how do we get it done, and that to me has been great, because you've got the chamber folks who are concerned about the economy, but also care about the environment. You got the environmental folks who are concerned about the environment, but also care about the economy. And everybody's kind of come together on this one. And it's one of those few issues that brings everybody together, which I think is very encouraging.
Yeah, it has been. And you're exactly right. And when you look at, I look at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, I look at the Sanibel Captiva Chamber of Commerce. They did not used to get along. 15 years ago, they weren't getting along particularly well on some issues. This is something that absolutely binds them together, and they speak with a single voice and a strong voice. And it's not just on Sanibel, but it's everywhere. I was up in D.C. I think last month at what they have as an Everglades Caucus, which is the different members from Florida. I think they're all from Florida, and you're right. They're Democrats and they're Republicans on that, and it's wonderful to see. We have Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Mara Diaz-Balart, who are both senior appropriators, both different parties, but both focused on the Everglades and focused on trying to get the money that we need to be able to finish these projects, so that the negative consequences don't impact us here in Southwest Florida. So that's really encouraging.
In terms of what people can do down here, talk a little bit more about the watershed concept. I mean, explain what the watershed is, and let's use Lee County for an example. I know some of our county commissioners have been leaders on this on the clean water issue. What can we be supporting from Sanibel, Fort Myers Beach, Lee County to just improve our own watershed that feeds into the Caloosahatchee?
It's basically it's best management practices, whether you're in agriculture or whether you're a homeowner. It's figuring out what those best management practices are for managing the water that's coming off of your property and then going into waters of the state. And if you go to SCCF, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation is one, and I keep coming back to them because I'm familiar with them, but they've got really good documents and things that, a fertilizer ordinance is something, I'm not I don't love regulatory policies, but maybe that's something that you want to look at as a town if you don't have it, or even if your town doesn't have it, you don't even have to have your town have it. You can just go, look, I'm not going to fertilize during the rainy season. I know better than that as a Florida homeowner, and I know that's not the responsible thing to do. My grass doesn't need it, and it's bad for our waterways. So it's things like that you just, xeriscape planting is another one. Native planting is another one.
What's xeriscape?
Xeriscape is something, it was big, and I'm going to get a little bit out of my lane here. It was big maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and it was using plants that don't use a lot of water. So you see a lot of rock lawns. That was, and I think xeriscape is more than rock lawns, but it was getting away from plants that use a lot of water. But I think that you can do that pretty effectively by using our native plants, which don't need, sort of by their design and the fact they grew up here, they don't need a lot of water.
We don't have we don't have any septic tanks here on Fort Myers Beach, but I know Lee County still has some. And I think they're working to clean those up and make sure those are functioning well.
Yeah, septic's an issue. Sanibel went to central sewer a long time ago, and it's very expensive to do. Some communities can afford to do it, others can't. And that goes back a little bit to what I was talking about, where we're doing better monitoring, and we're spending a lot more money monitoring, particularly as a district in a state. And one of the reasons we're doing that is that allows us to be really effective when we say, septic is an issue, because then we can look at where it's an issue, because it may not be an issue everywhere. It is, some places are fine, other places aren't. And it's finding those places that aren't and then targeting them and saying, hey, maybe you guys need some help, gals. So we'll come in and help you. And there is money there. There's state money there, whether it's a revolving fund or I'm not sure exactly how it's set up, but there is money. There's assistance for the town, for the unincorporated areas in the county to help address those areas. So if we know we've got a hot spot, if we know this area is really causing us a problem, we've just got a lot of stuff coming out of there and we can see it, and we can see it pop up, then we can address it. And that's what I'm hoping that we can do, rather than having the blanket shotgun approach haven't worked particularly well. It spooks people, and once Tallahassee gets spooked, things tend to not to happen, which I understand. So what you have to do is not spook them by saying, look, we're not going after everybody. We're going after the people who can be the most, we're going to see the biggest bang for buck.
Now, Chauncy, it gives me great peace to know that you're leading this massive organization, and you live in Sanibel, and Sanibel really is on the front lines of what comes out of the Caloosahatchee, as Fort Myers Beach is, to a similar extent. And so talk a little bit about your history in Sanibel. I know you were on the town council in Sanibel. Your dad was a member of Congress. I actually served as a staffer with your dad. Your dad was also on the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Yep.
And my boss was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I got to see your dad quite a bit, because I think they were both on the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee for a while. Yep. And that was a fascinating time for me in Washington. As a son of a congressman, did you live here in the district, or did you live out in D.C.?
No, Dad didn't run for Congress until I was out of college.
Okay, you were already out of college.
Yeah, he was back when I was young, and when I was growing up on Sanibel in the 70s. Dad became involved mostly in local government, and he and some of his friends they incorporated Sanibel, and so he was the first mayor of Sanibel.
Okay,
and they were very, very much in favor of home rule and pushed for that. And so he served on the city council and then he became a county commissioner and for District 1, and did that for a couple of years, and then he ran for Congress. So for me, it was growing up knowing sort of what land use planning was, knowing what a comprehensive land use plan was, and a rate of growth ordinance and other things like that, most kids don't.
We're revising ours right now this year.
There
Yeah.
Most kids don't spend a lot of time talking about it around the dinner table, but we did, because that was what, Dad was doing at the time.
Did your dad service, because I know it's a burden, and there's a lot of constituents calling at home, and there's a lot of meetings he has to attend. Did it make you more likely to be involved or less likely to be involved in public service? Obviously, you're heavily involved, but
much more. The political side, I mean, not to get too personal, I don't love politics, and I do love policy.
Yeah.
So it's just to be involved, to try and be able to make change and affect change is great. The political side of it can get a little ugly at times, but that's just.
How'd you get drawn into the Sanibel Council?
Let's see. There was an opening.
Were you running for an open seat, or was there a vacancy you got appointed for?
It was an open seat. Yeah.
So you ran as for the town council.
I did, but there was. Yes, I'm trying to remember. But that was not that long ago. But I ran, and it was. There were three of us. I can't remember. I think the way Sanibel does it, I think there were 2 seats open and maybe 3 people running. So that's the way it worked out. Yeah.
And then how did you get involved in your current position?
I don't really know. I knew the governor a little bit when he was working in DC, and I talked to him about some water quality issues, and he had just sort of stayed engaged over time. And then when he was running for governor, he was very engaged, particularly because it was 2017, 2018, and things weren't great, and he sort of knew how bad it was down in Southwest Florida. So we would have a lot of discussion then. So I think that when they looked at the water management district and what was going on with it and how the changes he wanted to make, he wanted people he probably felt more comfortable with.
And you worked out in DC, correct? Did you work for Congress, or were you in the private sector?
I worked for the Office of Management and Budget, and I worked on the Hill.
You were at OMB. Was Governor Governor Daniels there at OMB?
Mitch Daniels was my boss.
Was he really? He was my boss for 8 years.
He's a wonderful guy.
I was his insurance commissioner and his chair of the utility commission.
I love Mitch.
You worked for Mitch Daniels for at OMB. Boy, they used to call. I think President Bush called him the Blade. That was his nickname for him, because he was always looking to pinch pennies. Yeah.
Congress didn't like him much.
No, they didn't. He didn't have a lot of patience for Congress either, but he was a great leader. Yeah.
No, he was good. He was good. And then I worked on the House Budget Committee on their staff.
Oh, very good, very good. And so, talk a little bit about Hurricane Ian. Obviously, were you on Sanibel when the hurricane hit?
I wasn't. My oldest son was getting married in North Carolina, so we evacuated on Tuesday afternoon up to North Carolina, and so I watched. I watched from there. It was an interesting wedding. It was a wonderful wedding, but it was a very bittersweet watching sort of what was happening to our community and our house. I have a ground level house on the east end of Sanibel, and it was destroyed, and everything we owned was destroyed. So
I'm so sorry. And then, what was it like coming back to the island? And then, were you able to get back on the island?
No, it was really hard to get back on the island, and it was surreal. We actually were just up on the other side of the bridge there by Pinchers. We launched and went over, and just in awe of looking at the devastation that happened over here on the beach. And then going back to Sanibel, I mean, it's unrecognizable, and our house was sort of unrecognizable. So yeah, it wasn't fun, but it's just, you look back on it, and it's every day is, and I'm sure it's the same for everyone on the beach. Every day is a new day, and you take the new day.
Well, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for being here, Chauncy. Chauncey's a volunteer, has a massive job, but also massive opportunity to impact change for the better.
It is.
And I'm so hopeful for the future, and I'm so thankful for your service, and I'm thankful you took the time to come over here today. I know you got a lot on your plate as you're trying to get your life back together, and you still have a full-time job and a family, and I just want to thank you for your service.
Well, thanks for your interest in this, and thanks for advocating for it, because it's so important, and the more people who know about it, the more people talk about it, it really makes a difference. It's just amazing when we go to Tallahassee. People know the issues now. I mean, I think they always did, but particularly now that they know the issues. This is clearly something that Governor DeSantis has been, he's been a strong advocate for, a strong proponent for, and that's been, it's been incredibly helpful. So we're making good progress, and we just want to keep that progress up. And as I said, within the next decade, I hope this is all done and it'll be behind us. And then it'll be really neat to see the fruits of our labor there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for watching today. And again, if you find the content of this helpful and you'd be willing to share it with your friends and neighbors or post it on your Facebook page, we sure would appreciate it. And we're thankful for you being with us today and appreciate your time. God bless. Take care.
You take care of everyone else, but what about yourself and your mouth? Aspen Dental is here for you. We offer the treatments you need all under one roof. First visits are free for patients without insurance, and treatment plans are 20% off. Aspen Dental, anything to make you smile.
Quote, a witch hunt trying to take down the leading candidate by far in the Republican Party. Andrea Bernstein, NPR News, New York.
Much of California is still getting walloped by a winter storm. Heavy snow is falling in mountainous areas. Heavy rain is falling in lower elevations. That's melting a lot of snowpack and raising concerns about flooding. Kim George is a battalion chief for South Lake Tahoe Fire and Rescue.